On December 7, 1941, 360 Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military base on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. It destroyed a fleet of 8 battleships and killed around 2,300 people. President Roosevelt said to Congress, "December 7th is a date that will live in infamy." With a vote of 83-0 in the Senate and 388-1 in the House, the U.S. declared war on Japan on December 8th. 3 days later, Italy and Germany declared war on the U.S., ending its neutrality. The attack on Pearl Harbor sparked a lot of paranoia. The paranoia was because of Japanese Americans. This caused hate crimes and discrimination against the whole race. Since America was at war with Japan, many Americans assumed that the Japanese Americans were still loyal to their home country. This so-called issue of having Japanese Americans in America scared people, and inevitably resulted in restrictions for Japanese Americans. For instance, Japanese Americans were given a curfew because of the fear that they would cause more attacks on the U.S. These restrictions eventually came to the Supreme Court. In the case involved with Gordon Kiyoshi Hirabayashi, who was a Japanese American that stayed out past his curfew, the court voted in favor of General DeWitt, who was the one who set the curfew. Chief Justice Stone, who wrote the majority opinion, noted that, in time of war, residents having ethnic affiliations with an invading enemy may be a greater source of danger than those of a different ancestry. In February 1942, Roosevelt, as Commander-in-Chief, issued Executive Order 9066, which was to relocate all persons of Japanese ancestry from anywhere in the country, whether they were from inland or outside of Pacific military zones. The objectives were to remove all threats of espionage and also to protect Japanese people from racist Americans who would want to hurt them because of what their country did. Some may argue that some of the reasons that they were taken could have been purely out of racism. There was a near-panic state in parts of the West Coast, and the greed of special interest groups who would profit from the property loss of all the Japanese Americans favored the relocation exponentially. All people with Japanese ancestry were taken. Whether they were young, old, rich, or poor, they were all treated the same. At first, all of the Japanese people were ordered to small assembly centers near their homes, where they were later relocated to permanent wartime residences. Japanese people who went voluntarily had time to gather belongings and settle into their new residences, but the amount of them was very few. For the people that were forced to leave, the process was a nightmare. They were forced to sell all of their houses, businesses, farms, and restaurants, with steep discounts. They had 1 week to gather what belongings they could carry before they were moved to their assembly centers. The assembly centers near their homes had horrible conditions. Mostly, they were converted racetracks and fairgrounds where most of the people slept in stables like animals while they waited to be moved to their permanent wartime residences. Since the point of these camps were to get Japanese people away from Americans where they could hypothetically cause danger to them, they were in very secluded places. The War Relocation Authority camps were mostly in deserts, and they had rows of barracks surrounded by barbed wire and dotted with watchtowers all over so nobody could escape. Each barrack measured 20 by 100 feet, divided into 4 to 6 rooms. Each room housed one family, no matter how large the family. In some cases, 2 families would have to share a room, which made living conditions that much worse. The barracks were arranged in what was called a block, which was consisting of 12 to 14 barracks, a communal mess hall, bath and shower facility, toilets, laundry, and recreation hall. They were made of planks nailed to studs, covered with tar paper, with no interior wall. Because they were made so poorly, the walls tended to crack and allowed dust to settle inside. The conditions were very poor, and families had minimal privacy, if any. The internment camps were basically sugar-coated prisons. The camps were meant to be confined communities where people could live their lives happily. The sites of the camps were mostly inland and more east. Tule Lake, California, Minidoka, Idaho, Manzanar, California, Topaz, Utah, Jerome, Arkansas, Hart Mountain, Wyoming, Potsdam, Arizona, Grenada, Colorado, and Rawer, Arkansas. Approximately 116,000 people were moved away from their homes and had their constitutional rights violated. Japanese people had to wait in line for everything at these camps, going to the bathroom, getting meals, and they were treated like prisoners. The WRA attempted to establish sports events and social events within the camps to resemble some sort of normalcy, but harsh conditions within the camp soon resulted in conflicts. Some internees thought it was necessary that they should be in the camps, and the different ideas between the internees caused many shootings and deaths. Internees that were considered disloyal were moved to Tule Lake Camp in California, which was more of a prison-like camp. Japanese Americans who were deemed loyal were moved out of Tule Lake and into camps with better conditions. Japanese Americans who were loyal in the camps were also allowed to have short leaves for schooling or for work. There were small government establishments made by the people in the camps who made concerts, sports teams, and even places of worship. Soon enough, life became a routine in these camps, where students went to school and adults went to work, which was usually farming. The Caucasian military personnel had their own housing and resources that was much better than the internees. These camps went on for around 2.5 years before the last one was closed in 1945. After the war, there is a role that local groups played in justifying or challenging internment. These groups fought over whether Japanese Americans would return home or not. Some anti-Japanese groups that were against letting the Japanese people leave the internment camps were Remember Pearl Harbor League, or the RHPL, and the Japanese Exclusion League, or the JEL. These groups believed that all Japanese people were threats to America, and even argued that releasing them will put the economy in a bad position. The Remember Pearl Harbor League sent out flyers and held meetings to preach the anti-Japanese ideology. Pro-Japanese American groups were American Friends Service Committee and the Seattle Civic Unity Committee. These groups argued that the Japanese being held had nothing to do with what their country was doing, and it was their right as Americans to be freed from the internment camps. Eventually, these camps came to a close after the war, and people recognized how bad they were and how unnecessary. Years later, in 1988, President Ronald Reagan issued a bill that gave $20,000 to the 62,000 internees that were still living. This bill addressed the injustice of the evacuation and relocation of these people. America learned from this great injustice, and surely it will never happen again.